We are not experienced in interviewing,
It's not a problem.
but we are great fans of science fiction. So
It seemed to me that you were the most science fiction fans of the people I saw there this weekend. You know, you read a lot of science fiction.
yeah,
Yes.
bueno, ya estás we are here in Medellín, Colombia, with science fiction writer John Kessel. Hi, John.
Hi.
And also with Juan Diego Gómez,
Hi. Hola.
science fiction fan and writer also. Well, John, I'd like to start asking you how was your first encounter with science fiction? How did you know science fiction?
Gosh, it was a very long time ago when I was a little boy. I always liked stories that were about magical things and things that were impossible or didn't happen in the real world. My father used to tell me stories, fairy tales, when I was a boy, and he could tell them without reading from a book. He would just tell them aloud, and I remember those stories a lot. I liked hearing my father read to me or tell me stories. And so then when I learned to read and was in school, the teachers, of course, introduced us to many kinds of stories, and I can't remember the first science fiction story I ever read. It was probably a child's science fiction book, like maybe there was some books by Andre Norton. She was I didn't know it was a woman. She has a man's name, but she wrote a lot of books when I was a boy. And I went to the public library, and they had a section of science fiction, and so I started to read Andre Norton and Robert Heinlein juvenile books, and then Isaac Asimov and all of those writers. I really couldn't get enough of it. There was a series of science fiction books for young people that I read, and they were all different writers, and I read every one of them I could find, and so I really got. I was born in 1950, a long time ago, so this was around in the 1958, 59, 60, and then that was just when the space program was starting in the United States. When the Russians launched the first Sputnik, and then the United States started, they said astronauts and cosmonauts, and I was very excited about that. And then I discovered a science fiction magazines in like 1961 or 62.
Pulp Fiction, or something like that.
Yes, pulp magazines like Analog and Galaxy magazine and Fantasy and Science Fiction, and I subscribed to the magazines, and I started reading them all the time. So I lived to read science fiction. It was the most escape. I wanted to get away from everything.
Well, what is your a really common question? I suppose many of us readers and fans would like to know. What is your favorite science fiction writer?
Yeah. That's a good question. It changes over time. When I was young, my favorite was Isaac Asimov, and then also Robert Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke. I also like Ray Bradbury, all the classic writers. I liked all of them. And then I learned to really love Alfred Bester, and then a little later Clifford Simak and Philip K. Dick. Philip K. Dick was a little later, but I really liked him.
Where you live in those years?
I was living in a suburb of Buffalo, New York, which is a city in western New York State, and it was very industrial city. There's a steel plants and chemical factories and grain mills and auto factories. It's all factories, and so my family my parents were immigrants. My father was from Poland and my mom from Italy. And so all my relatives worked in the factories. And so it was very what we call in the United States blue collar workers. You know, nobody in my family ever went to college or worked. You know, but so actually the science fiction was a way for me to sort of see another thing, a bigger world. You know,
that is something like Asimov. I remember he wrote something very similar about his childhood.
Yes, he was an immigrant, and his father had a candy store in New York City, Asimov. And I remember reading about that and thinking, oh well, he knows what it's like. He's from a poor family, and he went to the university and became a professor, and so that's what I wanted to do. He was my model because he was a scientist who wrote science fiction, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a scientist who wrote science fiction, and so I went to university and studied physics to become an astronomer. And what happened was I discovered I wasn't as good at science as Isaac Asimov.
But you're now you are a professor.
I am a professor of English, of literature. So when I switched from physics to literature and went to graduate school, then I studied literature, and also I was working hard on learning to write, teaching myself to write and taking classes. So I started to write science fiction stories.
Yeah.
I was going to say, my favorite science fiction writers now are gosh, I mean, my friend James Patrick Kelly, I like his work a lot. I like Bruce Sterling. I like Paolo Bacigalupi. Some of the writers I talked about at the presentation.
And maybe books from the same writers, but what would you say is your favorite book?
That's a good question too. I'm a big fan of, I think one of the great books of science fiction or science fantasy is The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. Yeah, or it's also called Shadow of the Torturer, the 4 books in the series.
The Glow of the Torturer?
Yeah, and actually it's set in South America, you know that it's distant future, but it's in South America.
That series is one of my favorites. I haven't been able to get it, so I haven't read it.
Okay, I don't know if has it been translated to.
It has been translated, but it's very difficult. Just in Spain, didn't arrive to South America.
No, that's too bad. Because I think it would have a place here. At any rate, so I really like. He's a great writer, and I think that some other writers that he just passed away not too long ago. Thomas Dish wrote some wonderful books.
334?
334 and Camp Concentration. Those are really good books. Gosh, it's sometimes there's so many books they all go out of my head. I like Ursula Le Guin very much, and her books, The Left Hand of Darkness, and many of her short stories, The Dispossessed, so I like her a lot.
And what are you thinking? And what is the writer you think is most underrated from the science fiction writers?
That's good too.
For me, for example, I have a favorite one, Barry Malzberg.
Barry Malzberg, yes. Well, he was actually one of my favorites too, and I was influenced by his writing. And yes, he's not so appreciated as much as he should be. Yeah, I agree with that. I'm glad you mentioned his name.
I don't remember exactly the name of one of his short stories, well, not so short, Apollo and Beyond or something like that.
There's Beyond Apollo. Is that the one? Or
maybe I read it in Spanish.
It's about astronauts who are.
Yes, well, it was very critical of the Apollo program.
Yes, exactly. He's very sometimes very melancholy writer. And I've met him, and I'm sort of friends with him now, and that was big. It's funny, when I started to writing, one of my first stories was in fantasy and science fiction in 1979, and I was nobody. I've only published like 3 or 4 stories, and he sent me a postcard after the story came out, telling me it was really good, and wow. Harry Maltzberg really liked my story, so that was a really generous thing he did to do that.
Yeah,
That's good.